to Mike and his team at Prospect to be able to come together to have a proper look at what's going on across this sort of self-employed sector. And you're right, there's so many different definitions. There's so many. The way people work today cannot be sort of pigeonholed into one category of saying, well, they're self-employed or etc. It cuts across so many different ways that people work, and that's part of the problem. Is there isn't that clear sort of understanding of how people work, and therefore how we can support them. And what this pandemic has highlighted is that this lack of understanding and the lack of how we can support people who work in this sector. So the report is there. I hope people have had the opportunity to look at it. It sort of did throw up some pretty stark findings in terms of the research that we did, and it's quite worrying. The most worrying thing for me is the fact that people are now, significantly less likely to want to become self-employed due to their experiences. And if we are not encouraging people to be these entrepreneurs and innovators, then I think it's to the detriment of all of us and to the society and to the economy. So I think 88%, I'm just looking at the findings here, 88% said that the level of support was not fair and it was not a fair reflection of their tax contribution. 79% would oppose the equalisation of national insurance contributions between employees and the self-employed. 51% would support paying more out of their wages in exchange for a stronger safety net. And interestingly, from the trade union perspective, 75% of people didn't believe that they had sufficient workplace rights compared to employees. So that was sort of broadly some of the findings that came out in the research that ourselves and Prospect did. How we now take that forward in terms of using that research to create a campaigning document, because I think that's what we need to do. We need to sort of really invigorate the campaign around support for the sector. So there's a number of specific policy recommendations, both what we think need to be done immediately, and then in issues that need to be done maybe in the medium to longer term to ensure that people can sort of get the support that they need. In the immediate term, though, we're saying the government must maintain the 80% rate for the self-employed income support scheme. We should commit to allowing those who submit tax returns in January to access the fourth round of SEISS. 50% threshold for earnings from self-employment should be reduced, and the 50,000 earnings threshold should be increased. So there's a number of specific policy recommendations that we would put forward and ask you as our colleagues within Parliament to take forward on our behalf and to lobby government and all parties to adopt some of these policies. We will be watching with interest, as we all will, when the Chancellor stands up to announce the budget, because we want to see what measures and support measures he's going to put in place. I'm not sure whether you want me to say too much more at this point. I'll probably hand over to Mike, who will give you more of an overview of where we are, and then obviously welcome to take part in any further debate. But
Thank you very much, Roy, for that overview. And if colleagues haven't seen the report, I would really recommend you download it. There are so many commonalities with what we're calling for and what this report is calling for. But also, just before we move across to Mike, Roy, it was trailed in the weekend papers that Rishi Sunak was talking about national insurance for self-employed being raised. not in PAYE, but just in self-employed, because they had benefited from support. So they should therefore pay more in national insurance contributions. Well, I can't tell you the outrage that that caused for those people who've not had a penny for a year, and suddenly now are looking at their national insurance going up for something they didn't receive. But it's interesting that in your report, 51% would support paying more for national insurance and out of their wages if they got more support, for example, shared parental leave or holiday pay and sick pay in the same way that a PAYE employee would. I don't know if you want to comment on that before I move over to Mike. Roy?
No, I mean, just as you said there, Tracy, I think it's about the overall package. And, if you can see you are getting a fair share and you're getting a fair sort of support mechanism, then of course people would be prepared to look at that. I mean, why wouldn't they? The issue at the moment is they're not getting that level of support, and they don't have. And again, I don't think you can sort of isolate that from the whole issue about having a safety net that will sort of a safety net is a safety net. Hopefully, it should never be used, and it shouldn't be used in normal circumstances. These are people who want to work, want to earn, want to create wealth, want to go on to employ people. But there needs to be a safety net there, because that's what everybody else kind of enjoys. If you're in normal employment, you get a safety net, and that's what these people are quite rightly asking for. And we support that. I mean, and the research has shown that yes, people would be prepared to contribute more if there's that safety net that they can sort of count on when we get into difficult times like we've been through the last 12 months. This is an unprecedented situation that everybody's saying, and I think people would be prepared to contribute if they got that level of support.
Thank you, Roy. And certainly when Rishi Sunak talks about the self-employed, he always refers to the figure. If you're saying you earn £50,000 in profits, you're probably taking 200. I mean, I don't understand the people he hangs out with are different people to the people I hang out with. But certainly your call for a commissioner, I think, would enable the Treasury to understand the lived experience of those people who are self-employed and freelance. So I think we have very much support, lots of support for your recommendations. So moving on to Mike, Prospect's General Secretary, Mike Clancy. Mike's been the General Secretary since March 2012. Prospect Union has 150,000 members, including engineers, scientists, managers, civil servants, specialists in the public and private sector, and also absorbed into Aspect Trade Union. And in January 2017, the broadcasting union BEC2 merged with Prospect and remains a distinct sector of the union. And we know that BEC2, along with Prospect, have been real advocates for our sector over this last year. So Mike, over to you, if you'd like to make a few comments on this excellent report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. I think what might benefit is just sharing with you some of my direct experience from April and May of last year, because we were, with various policy officers in the union, talking directly to the Treasury officials. Now, you can understand that the government put in place income support schemes, the JRS and SAYS, at some speed in face of quite extraordinary circumstances that were unfolding. And we immediately started to press, and indeed, if you recall, there was a great deal of engagement with trade unions back in the spring and to some extent summer of 2020. That's given away a little bit to maybe, shall we say, something of a return to a little bit of a distance with trade unions. But we were deeply engaged with them, giving them advice about the practical realities of the provisions that they were putting in place. We immediately seized on the gaps in support for the self-employed. Now, that's because Prospect, like community, has a long history of representing people who have various forms of employment. There's obviously the conventional, direct employment, but in our BEC2 sector, self-employment, freelance work is not a tax dodge. It's a term of hire in that labour market. And it's a term of hire in a few labour markets that we deal with. I'll come back to that because it's really important. But it was against that background of experience of the different sorts of arrangements that people have that we started to engage with Treasury officials. And probably, you know, in the best traditions of a trade union, we didn't just point out the problems, we proposed solutions. We proposed solutions back then in relation to how tax returns were composed for the self-employed, how information sources could be validated to dispel concerns in the Treasury that there could be some magnification of fraud opportunity here. We literally went down to the detail of how professional accountants support self-employed and freelance returns. And we made proposals about the 50,000 threshold and various other technical proposals to the Treasury. Now, obviously, Treasury officials are not going to commit the Chancellor until there is a policy decision. But it abruptly stopped in May. And in hindsight, I think it stopped in May because on a whole range of measures, the government thought the pandemic was over. That we'll actually be back at work in the summer, that they could probably ride some criticism from different groups that they've been left excluded, because it wouldn't be long before we'll all be back at it. And how wrong that's proven to be on a whole range of issues. But once they had set their face against filling the gaps that were self-evidently there and the inequities between different groups and the, you know, the simple, cliff edges of 50,000 and then one side or other of it, they weren't prepared to change. And of course, successively, this has gone on much, much longer, quarter by quarter, month by month. And here we are at a budget a year later, and there is still a bewildering attitude to people who have previously been lauded as a key engine of economic change and economic growth. Now, it is important to have some categorizations here to understand the nature of the people. We have people in this economy who require a sword of justice approach to the resolution of their issues because they are genuinely exploited through employment contract forms, through 0 hours, and through other forms of one-sided employment constructs. Some of that applies to the self-employed and freelance. But the way I characterize this is that there's a group of people here who were previously relatively confidently navigating the labor market on a self-employed and freelance basis. It may have suited them, and it's certainly suited engagers in particular labor markets to have that fluidity of employment form, to be able to turn on and off labor. And indeed, a number of creative people would enjoy the benefit of being able to move to different types of assignments, given the nature of production and one another. What the last 12 months has done is brought a whole range of new people into an experience of privation that they never thought they'd have. By suddenly finding themselves as dispossessed in the labor market, as many people have found themselves dispossessed in the labor market for some decades. And it's even more bewildering for those people because previously they've been considered, as Roy said, to be entrepreneurial, to have a certain individualism and flair that they might bring to how they conduct themselves. And they were left high and dry by the government for no good policy reason. There is an exaggerated sense around fraud. We proposed means by which this could be de-risked, and they simply were left on the table. So the ongoing sense of grievance for several million people is palpable. You mentioned the speculation over the weekend, and obviously there were the days when budgets were confidential, but now, of course, chunks of them are speculated upon along the way. I mean, we commented upon it yesterday as being a wanton irresponsibility from the Chancellor to be contemplating further changes here, which would be detrimental to self-employment and to freelance. And let's not forget that we still have IR35 reforms there floating in the near distance. So we've got the ongoing sense of grievance in terms of the gaps, which I think is entirely understandable. We have an uncertain policy future. Now, 64% of people that we have surveyed, and the important thing about our report here, it's not that it's just two trade unions. It's done in an alliance with the FSB, and we've taken evidence from such a broad church of opinion. Because naturally, trade unions want regulation, we want rights, we want that form of structure. What's interesting, given the experiences, so do more of these people who maybe previously wouldn't have reached for such ideas. But 64% of them question whether they'll continue in self-employment. That is significant. So this whole issue sits at a really important point of labour market reform. We have an employment bill which must address employment status, one assumes, not least because of the Uber judgment, in the autumn of this year. Right? We have potentially a recovery phase in front of us, but we will still have ongoing restrictions for some time. And many of these people operate in restricted areas, not least in the creative sector. How is all of this experience going to feed into labour market reform? One of the things I've treaded very carefully with on this is this question of, do we understand the breadth of people's experiences in this area as well as we should do? Do they really want potentially more rights, or is this a short-term response to gaps in the income support? Do they really want tax reform and changes in the benefit system? And I think more confidently, as a result of this report, we can say, yes, there is an appetite here. There is an appetite here, not least because maybe what the Uber judgment tells us in a slightly different way is, if it looks like a worker, it's quite likely they are a worker. Now, we don't want to lose some of the positive fluidity, positive experiences, and the ability to move through different forms of production, say in the creative sector and elsewhere, by implementing an overly rigid response to this. But the balance is not right. The experience that people have had in the last 12 months tells us that we have to reconsider the employment form, the definitions, the tax wraparound, the benefit system, and it has to be done in a holistic way, because one lever affects another lever. And that's why a commissioner, a thorough investigation, a full consultation before the government comes up with changes in the employment bill is absolutely necessary, or we're going to repeat the policy failures. There's going to be a partiality to this. You know, you'll change one part of the employment definition and it won't cohere with the tax system, and we will be in the same situation. And also, for a number of these individuals, for example, we engaged with very successfully with film and production, as I'm sure you've heard, to get people back into safe working conditions last summer, and we've continued to maintain that dialogue. But there are issues about people's safety who are self-employed, and the question of extension of proper regulation to them as well. And as we represent also the Health and Safety Inspectorate, we're particularly seized, and I think in a position to talk about that. So I really hope that that tomorrow's events don't compound an existing and understandable sense of grievance amongst people who were previously the friends of the Conservative Party, which we might say, and considered to be, part of a reshaping of our labour market. And it's going to continue to be more fluid and more employment forms. These people have been left high and dry. Let's hope it's not compounded tomorrow, but let's hope that the work of your committee here and others can start to really influence government over the rest of the spring and summer as it decides what it's going to do in the employment bill at the end of the year. Thank you.
That was so interesting, Mike, and certainly your insider knowledge of the way that the enthusiasm to work with unions around this dropped away in May. And then we had Eat Out to Help Out, didn't we? And so it was almost like it was over. And then suddenly they were left with this cohort that they couldn't come down the mountain and help one group, because then they'd have to help everybody. And so Rishi Sunak just got his fingers crossed and hoping it would all be over soon, so he wouldn't have to address it. But also your point that this model of working is encouraged by employers. who want people to be in a freelance situation and a tax regime. And certainly your comment about fraud, it is very perplexing how government don't seem to understand there's very limited opportunity for fraud to enable new starters to submit their tax accounts for this year and then be included in the 4th round of SAYS. And there is little possibility of fraud for PAYE freelancers, when as a PAYE employee, you HMRC knows what you're doing, and then having submitted your tax return and self-assessment for the freelance side of your employment, that is very clear and is overseen by an accountant. So it does feel like the fraud roadblock is sometimes inflated in order to not have any action around it, to help the Treasury from just saying, well, we can't do anything because of fraud. I think it's really important that we try and keep making that case.
Well, if I may say so, Tracy, I wish the government was as consistent on probity across all of its transactions as it seems to want self-employed people to be in terms of their tax returns. I mean, you know, there are some questions about how contracts have been let of late. So I'm in no doubt that the probity issue, the fraud issue, has been inflated as a means of diverting attention from the actual the detail.
Really interesting. So I'll now open it up to my fantastic campaigning colleagues from the all-party parliamentary group. I know that Caroline had to go, but she leaves a message that she will we all will redouble our efforts for campaigning, and certainly in the next few hours before Rishi Sunak gets on his feet, we'll be making as much noise as possible around this. So I'll go to my fantastic colleague, Catherine West, who I know she has many freelancers in her constituency of Hornsey. Catherine.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for bringing together such good witnesses. I wanted to ask about specifically the cultural sector, and obviously, you know, we've got champions of the sector hoping everything's going to open up again at the end of May. But I'm wondering whether our witnesses think there's anything specific that could be done for women who are affected disproportionately, both because they happen to do well in this particular area, and therefore in 1 year, if they have a good year, they can earn really quite well, 50 or 60, 70,000, but during the pandemic have obviously been affected terribly, and so have had to, you know, scrabble around for different jobs and so on. Is there anything that, from your experience, I could be calling for in Parliament that would specifically help those women who want to continue in the cultural sector but really are feeling quite desperate right now? Mike,
and then I'll come to you, Roy.
So thank you for the question. Obviously, very, very welcome. We have been engaging with a number of trade associations, industry associations, and directly with a number of the key institutions to try to keep people available through furlough, through other arrangements, and there had to be some tough discussions, particularly in the theatre sector, about retaining people and to allow the recovery. I think the key thing is that employers and engagers need to actually be clear about whether they have the data and the understanding to work through the clear imbalances that you're referring to. So, for example, at a national level, the government doesn't actually have a data set which would allow the proper interrogation of the disparate impact of both freelance working, self-employed, and clearly likely to be a form of employment which would support the disproportionate challenges that women have in terms of childcare and in more general caring responsibilities. So we don't actually have a national data set, and also the data sets I'm sure could be improved as well at a sector level. Frankly, the issue is going to be the scramble for the available employment once the restrictions lift. And whenever there's a scramble like that, there's a disproportionate impact. So we are going to have to, I think the issue is that employers and engagers need to be required by government to be alive to this, to work with worker voices, with unions, and to look very clearly at the consequences of how they recover and test that through the data they have about the potential disparate impact of what they do over this next period. And there is going to be a scramble. We know that people are desperate for work, and that's exactly the conditions in which people who have other responsibilities can be adversely affected. So I think there's a huge awareness raising. There is a real danger that once restrictions are lifted, the sense will be it's over. It's only beginning. The return to this, the consumer confidence, the engagement of people, both as employees, self-employed, to return to spaces, all of that will need to be worked through very carefully. And there's often been scant government advice in this respect, in particular from DCMS.
Fantastic, Mike. And certainly we saw with the social media of the COVID impact on women, and it was women doing in the graphic everything with the guy watching the telly on the sofa. I mean, they are just so out of touch seemingly for a modern government. It just is very confusing. I'm going to come to you, Roy, and then over to Alison, if you're still with us, Alison, because I wonder if you could give us an update on the work that you've been doing. So over to you, Roy.
Well, just briefly on that specific point, I think Mike really did sort of sum it up tremendously well. So yes, an awareness of the situation, and not just an awareness, but I think an onus on action. We should definitely understand the data, but then behind that there should be, what are we going to do about that, and how are we going to, and what can we do to ensure that there's an action point that picks up that. Possibly one of the things, and just looking at practical help within the report, talking about a specific recommendation may well be, and this may help in this area, this introduction of this freelancers fund to support employers where there is a large sort of freelance workforce, to be able to give employers the confidence to re-engage people and start rehiring people. So that might be a practical point, but definitely, as Mike says, an awareness and an understanding of what people need to do once they are aware of the situation, not just to ignore it, but to actually take practical steps to ensure that women aren't disproportionately disadvantaged when things hopefully start to get back to normal.
Thank you, Roy. And certainly the commissioning of an independent inquiry into the exclusion of self-employed, and that must happen because it's so obvious they don't understand this sector. That must be one of our biggest requests to government into that review, because we can't carry on like this. This has just highlighted that deficit in knowledge. Alison, I don't know, you've been working very closely with Pregnant Then Screwed, whether there's an update from the work that you've been doing.
Hi, thanks very much, and thanks very much to Mike and Roy for their presentations. I think they were really good in terms of setting out the issues that we're facing in the time ahead as well. I suppose the brief update is, I understand from Pregnant Then Screwed that they've had an email from the Prime Minister's office asking for a discussion with Paul Scully MP, the Minister, to sort of take forward some of the issues that they'd raised, specifically around the impact on women through maternity leave and pregnancy. So hopefully that will bring some kind of result. Whether that's in time for the budget on Thursday, I don't know, because it all feels a wee bit last minute. But it does offer certainly some hope that the government are finally looking at this if they're offering that meeting. So I do hope that there'll be some progress there, because I think, as you were saying, Tracy, the impact has fallen disproportionately in women in lots of ways. And I know certainly from lots of the women that I know, they've been struggling with working from home or working in key worker roles and trying to juggle homeschooling and try to do everything else that they have to do as well. So there has been a disproportionate impact. And the question around how you restart that was being raised there, when women are still having to take on a lot of these roles, and how women can get back into the workplace if there is that scramble that I think Mike was talking about. That's a real challenge, and the government need to be thinking about that, because otherwise women will lose out altogether and won't get back into work in the way that they want to get back into work, because they've got to continue these other caring roles.
Absolutely.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. My worry is that we pushed for a meeting with Treasury, and we've had 2 meetings with Jessie Norman and nothing has changed. So my worry is that it's like to keep us slightly quiet, because you've got your meeting to look forward to plan for, and then nothing happens. I wonder if I could broaden this out slightly. Obviously, there's differentials around the country. Scotland and Wales did support freelancers immediately. It felt they were really open to the idea that they needed emergency support. I don't know if, Christina, you wanted to give us an overview of how you think this report could potentially help those freelance and self-employed in Wales?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, for bringing me in. The Welsh Government has done its best to fill in the gaps. And for example, its Economic Resilience Fund helped far more people than the UK government ever did. And there's a special fund, a cultural fund as well. And we're going to examine the detail of tomorrow's budget, because they've made all sorts of trails in the press that they're going to provide certain things to the Welsh Labour government, but we're always very cautious, because we never know whether this is new money or old money being rehashed. So, there's an element of caution all the time with announcements, and I don't think I'd be talking out of turn to say that Mark Drakeford has led in Wales, despite not having much cooperation from the UK government. As far as freelancers and cultural workers are concerned, and women in this sector, it's so important in Wales. I mean, it was St. David's Day yesterday, and we're a nation steeped in culture, as you know, Tracy. And the fact that we couldn't celebrate yesterday in the way that we normally do is heartbreaking. But I'd like to pledge my support for the report. I thought the report was absolutely excellent. And to listen to you today, Roy and Mike, clarifying your thoughts and the way forward, I think it gives us genuine hope. So if there's anything I can do at all to support, then I'm there.
Thank you, Christina. And of course, we all know the culture of Wales, and Cardiff is the beating heart of that. And I always love going there to see all that, the BBC all along the river, the coast there, just fantastic and so innovative and exciting. So we're going to wind up in a moment. We don't need to take more time than we need. I think we're all incredibly busy on our Zooms, but I just come to Peter, another member of the group, just for your thoughts, Peter, if you'd like to make a comment.
Thanks very much, Tracy, and thanks for Mike and Roy. You both gave very interesting and insightful contributions. And as always, when I come to meetings like this, I've certainly learned something. I hope I can contribute something as well. Yesterday, I spoke in a brief debate where Parliament agreed to give an HMRC exemption on income tax to a lot of people who come to Glasgow and London later in the year as part of the delayed Euro 2020 football competition. It's a standard thing for these big things that the teams, there's national sports organisations, and also accredited media people don't have to pay income tax in the country they're working in during that time. And although that's the right thing to do, it did strike me as a bit ironic that there will be freelancers working with these media companies who get indirect taxpayer support from the UK Treasury for being able to work, and yet freelancers in the United Kingdom get no support when they're not able to work. And it's amazing how often, when we look at the people who've been excluded from support, how often these ironies just jump up and punch you in the nose and make you realise this can't be it can't be justifiable. And I completely agree with some of the comments that Mike made earlier on. In the very early days, you could understand that the government's priority was, what can we do very quickly to support a big number of people with as uncomplicated a system as possible? So the furlough scheme for employees came in. They've had the best part of a year, within a few days of a year, to do something to support the various different types of self-employed people around the UK, and they've done next to nothing. And that tells me that it's not because they can't, it's because they don't care enough. But one question I wanted to ask Mike about the survey, I mean, we were all concerned when we saw the headline figure about the number of self-employed people that are seriously thinking about not going back to self-employment when things start to improve. That's bad enough, but depending on where those self-employed people are and what jobs they're doing, the wider impact on all of us could be really quite substantial. If somebody's a self-employed IT consultant, the chances are they'll find a way to keep working as an IT consultant, might become an employee somewhere else and indirectly maybe displace somebody elsewhere in the labour market, but they'll probably keep doing the jobs that they've been doing. If half the self-employed motor mechanics in the United Kingdom just give up and go off to work in supermarkets or warehouses, if half the self-employed hairdressers give up, half the self-employed people who own cafes that keep our communities and shopping centres vibrant, if a significant number of these people just give up and go away, the impact on the way that our society operates will be, if anything, bigger than the economic impact. So I wanted to ask Mike, within the figures that you're looking at, was there enough of a sample size to get any picture as to whether there are particular kinds of self-employed jobs that we're in danger of seeing a significant exodus from when things start to get back to, or head back to the new normal? Because I don't think they'll ever be back to what was normal before. Final comment, and Mike mentioned the fact that last year the government were too keen to think everything was all over. And there's a danger that when the public health emergency is finally under control, that the government will think the economic emergency is finished. Food rationing in the United Kingdom lasted almost twice as long after the Second World War as it lasted during the Second World War. It was 9 years after the end of the war before food rationing was stopped. Now, clearly we haven't been in a war, but we have been through a shock that's had a significant impact economically and socially. And some of the harmful effects that the government has had to put in place are going to be around for a long, long time after the public health crisis has passed. And at the moment, I'm not convinced either the Prime Minister or the Chancellor of the Exchequer have even thought about what happens next year when the pandemic has passed, but the economic damage is still here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. And very stark warning there regarding rationing. You're absolutely right. Mike and Roy, if you want to make your final comments.
So, Peter, thank you very much for those remarks. They go to probably the final comments I wanted to make, but I'll also try and just address them very briefly. I think citizens are entitled to expect that the government understands the parameters and the nature of the labour market that they've been sponsoring. It was demonstrated in April and May last year. The government had little or no data sets and structure and understanding of the broadly described categories self-employed and freelance. And for example, had really no comprehension of the complexities around pay-as-you-earn freelancers, which really came as, I think, almost like a shock that such employment forms existed and were actually falling between JRS and SAYS. From there, Peter, I've got some recollection that we do have some sub-data on particular occupations. What I do know from I'll get our policy guys to share that with the committee. What I do know is that we've got data about attitudes, particularly in the creative sector, because there is always a fragility, I need hardly say to Tracy and so on, to the creative sector and people's affinities to it, which are deep, but are often vulnerable to economic shock. So we've definitely got concerns that people are, well, first of all, people have had to move away. There's a whole range of occupations. I mean, you know, airline pilots who are driving for Uber, just one example of actually the displacement of one occupation type into another, which will then have a percussive effect, and I think, Peter, this is behind your question, on unemployment generally. And actually, we are potentially returning to something that I experienced growing up in Liverpool in the 1980s, which is structural unemployment as a result of the pandemic. And we have to have that conversation and how we're going to deal with it. Because as I said earlier, any sense that this is over simply because doors are starting to reopen, shows are starting to go on, that would be, we have to keep the focus of government on the consequences for much longer here. And then what does it mean for the labour market? Because I'll close with this final point, and I will try and find some of that data for you, Peter, because I think it exists. Self-employed and freelance is not a gigantic tax hedge. It's often a term of hire, a structure of the labour market, and people are entitled to be seen in that context. And we've got to keep the foot to the pedal here over the spring and summer as we head into the employment bill, and not actually let up now on the question of the extant grievance of the gaps in the self-employed scheme. Thank you.
Excellent. Roy, then I'll come to Christina and then we'll wind up.
Yeah, just briefly, Tracy, sort of echoing a lot of what's already been said in one sense is what's come out of this discussion. And Peter was right to say, you know, I've learned a lot from listening to the debate, is that this lack of awareness or understanding. The other thing where self-employed and freelancers shouldn't feel too different to people who have sort of employed status is that something similar is that there doesn't appear to be any joined-up writing or any joined-up thinking, I should say, within government. We attend, and Mike and myself attend, lots of briefings and meetings with ministers from other departments, and there doesn't appear to be any sort of real sort of joined-up thinking. And for one example would be the Treasury, of course, and the business department. So you'll have a meeting with the business department, a really good meeting, and then, you know, they have to go away and talk to the Treasury, and the Treasury might say no, and you go, well, why not get them all in the same room and all have this discussion together? And no, that's always kind of pushed back or frowned upon in some way. So that's why I think finally one of the issues that we really do need, and I think it's something we can all work together to push. And you mentioned it, Tracy, is this new commissioner to sit within government who will be the advocate, who will be the spokesperson, who will be the voice to be able to try and pull all of this together to create this joined up sort of approach, joined up thinking. Because at the moment, the way the departments appear now, I'm sure they'll tell us that's not the case, but the fragmentation that appears to be there isn't helpful and isn't really achieving anything for anybody. So I'd leave on the point that I think, if nothing else, we should be pushing for a spokesperson, an advocate within government, a commissioner who's going to actually champion the rights and you know, for self-employed and freelancers. I think that's what's needed.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Tracy. I just want to pay tribute to my dear friend Howard Francis, the former MP for Aberavon, who passed away on the 14th of February after a very short illness. It's his funeral today. Howard leaves a legacy behind him that's steeped in culture. He always fought for the oppressed, a great human rights activist. His legacy goes far and wide. He formed relationships with the miners communities in Appalachia, which carry on today. And I'll be standing outside the Onslow Welfare Hall, where we had many events today to pay tribute to Howard with his dear friends. His cortege is leaving his house in Crynant, my next village, and going through the valleys before going to his Aberavon constituency. And we're all still in shock. We've lost a dear comrade, and we've lost our leader in the Delice Valley. So it's a very sad day. Howard gave me more than words can say. Sorry, Tracy, I just wanted to say that.
Can I jump in, Tracy? I do apologise, but those who know me know that I spent all of my informative years working in Wales. I covered the Welsh region for the ISTC, the steel industry, for over 12 years. Howard Francis was a very good friend. I knew him and his family very well. and it's probably true to say, I mean, the Aberavon constituency is where the Port Talbot, the huge Port Talbot Steelworks sits, and we spend many occasions sitting with Harold discussing strategy and tactics, how we could protect and nurture the steelworks. I don't think the steelworks would be there today if it wasn't for Harold and the work that he did. So I'd just like to, I didn't know Christina was going to make that contribution, but I'd just like to sort of echo it, agree with it, and in some way add my union's thanks and contribution to Harold Francis. He was a great guy.
What a lovely comment, and I'm so sorry for your loss, Christina. He does sound like a man whose life was lived with great purpose, and actually makes us even more determined to have our own legacy as strong and as powerful as his. And coming into politics very late in my life, I'm very impatient to get things done and to leave that sort of legacy. And I'm sure Stephen Kinnock will also agree, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants there. So thank you very much for that contribution. So I'll draw our meeting to a close. I want to say thank you so much, Mike and Roy, for that really thoughtful presentation. And the parallels with our own report at the All Party Parliamentary Group are very profound. We understand the sector, we understand what needs to be done, and working with the unions, and hopefully if you working with us, we will push the government to understanding that work now needs to be done. The pandemic has exposed the fault lines. We now need to close them. So thank you everyone for taking
very much.
it out. Please do, if you haven't read the report,
thank you all.
A look. And hopefully we'll see you again, Mike and Roy. And thank you to my colleagues for joining today. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Love you.
Thanks.
Bye now.